Well, what is happening today in Saudi Arabia is that Mohammad Ben Salman, who's becoming the new strongman of the country and has been rising since 2016, he's currently the crown prince, but he is the most important person in the Saudi political scene. Well, he is basically trying to undo most of the old ways that Saudi Arabia used to have to be governed. And so what we're seeing, especially with the clerics, is that this pact that was at the foundation of the kingdom is now being questioned. Because this pact meant especially that the clerics controlled religion but controlled society through especially the religious police, which was the arm of the clerics to enforce their religious views on society. And all of this now is being completely changed. The religious police can no longer arrest people on the streets, and they're barely seen now in the streets of Riyadh. He's redefining the religious norm in his own way, against the will of the clerics. Things like entertainment, to which the clerics were opposed, are now being promoted in the kingdom. And this is completely new. He's doing this, of course, out of personal reasons, probably more than ideological reasons. I mean, there's a bit of ideology in the sense that he believes that in order to reform the country, he needs to reform the economy, and in order to reform the economy, he needs to reform society. But he's also destroying a counterpower. I think there's really a power grab going on in Saudi Arabia, and the religious elite, the clerics, were not just an ideological force, they were a political force in the kingdom. They were a counterpower. They had a lot of autonomy, they had a lot of influence, and Mohammed bin Salman doesn't want anyone who can compete with his own influence. He wants to establish a complete authority over the system. So basically, again, it's always difficult to understand what's going on because it's both a process that is driven by personal ambitions, but that is also structural in many ways and has structural implications. MBS's idea is that he would like to make Saudi Arabia an extra-large version of the United Arab Emirates, the country next door, which is a country that resembles Saudi Arabia in many ways, but it's smaller, but is governed by an authoritarian regime, very authoritarian, together with a well-functioning economy and a relatively open society that's globalization-friendly. And I think he would like to transform Saudi Arabia into something of that kind, which means that there's going to be more authoritarianism, but at the same time, probably changes in the society and the economy that are going to have long-term implications. I don't think it will be easy for him to succeed, right? What happened in the UAE, which is, again, a smaller country than Saudi Arabia, happened for particular reasons that are not present in Saudi Arabia. I think Saudi Arabia is much more complex for this type of change. Saudi Arabia has been resting on foundations that were built 3 centuries ago. And what he's doing basically is that he's trying to basically destroy those foundations and rebuild the country on other foundations and around his own persona. And all of this is kind of a risky bet. There's both in Vision 2030 a public relations thing and a genuine, I think, initiative. I think most in the Saudi elite kind of agreed that the country was going to face economic problems, that the economic model that had been followed until now in Saudi Arabia was no longer could no longer function, because it was all very dependent on oil and oil rent. It produced very little, and Saudi economy could not forever depend on that. So I think here he is basically putting into words and putting into a program the vision that many had in Saudi Arabia. Of course, he's doing it also as a public relations stunt. He is consolidating power. He's basically, as I said, taken power and consolidating power now against many, many enemies internally and powerful enemies within the family, among the clerics, among the economic elite. And he needs to do that, a discourse that basically constructs an image for him, gives him legitimacy. Especially that he's someone that nobody knew back in 2015. He's a newcomer to the scene. And especially internationally, right? I think a lot of those efforts were meant at enhancing the image of Saudi Arabia and his own image internationally, and making himself accepted by the leaders of the world by, again, wearing that hat of the super reformer who is going to transform Saudi Arabia into a country that, you know, the West would like, because the Western countries tend to have a lot of criticism of Saudi Arabia, but what he's offering to the West is also a vision that speaks to the West and appeals to the West. So what is complicated here is that I think to some extent there's something genuine there, right? That translates genuine aspirations to transform Saudi Arabia into a model that could function better than it does right now. But it's also linked to his persona, which means that, and it's perfectly possible that at some point when he thinks he has consolidated power enough, when he's reached his personal goals, he may actually decide to abandon a lot of those early reforms that he promoted and return to a more conservative form of politics, because he wouldn't need to campaign anymore for. So that's the thing. I mean, we've seen before Saudi kings coming to power and presenting themselves as great reformers, and then just after they've consolidated power, becoming conservatives. So it's perfectly possible that it will go that way as well. I think there's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to the future of Saudi Arabia.